Welcome to the Mind Solution podcast with Sarah Maud. The Mind Solution podcast is for leaders like you who are passionate about well-being in the workplace because you understand that a strong, resilient and happy workforce is the key to your organisation's success. The Mind Solution podcast is here to help you. So join us every week where we'll share with you powerful insights, strategies and know-how to ensure that your people and your organisation are truly thriving from the inside out. Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Mind Solution podcast. My name's Sarah Maud and today we're going to be talking about managing mental health in the workplace and 4 strategies that you can adopt as a manager to manage the mental health and well-being of your people. So managing mental health in the workplace, well, it's probably fair to say that there has never been a more pivotal time to manage the mental health and well-being of your people. It's now, what is it? Is it month 7? Is it month 8? I feel like I'm in this time bubble of lockdown, of coronavirus. And what we're really starting to see and also gather statistics on is how this whole situation is impacting the mental health and well-being of your employees. And what we're certainly seeing come through is varying statistics, which a lot of it's based on certain demographics. So whether you're a snowflake, whether you're a millennial, whether you're an Generation X, Y, how much space you have in your home, whether you've got a proper workstation. We've got some people that are being really impacted because they find that the boundaries are blurred between home and work. They haven't got that spatial commute to be able to separate them from work and home mentally in their minds. We've got some people that are just really Zoom fatigued. We're coming into winter. The clocks have just changed. We're going to be plunged in the UK, certainly, into darkness for the next, about 4 months. And there's a lot of apprehension that goes alongside that. So people thinking, how am I going to cope with not really being able to get outside or not wanting to get outside when it's really cold and dark and wet? So we've got these ongoing issues that are impacting people's mental health and well-being. We've got people that, they're a bit more attuned to what's going on. They're in a bit more of a routine and a rhythm, but there's still very little light at the end of the tunnel. Still a lot of organisations that are working from home. Still a lot of people that are on furlough. We've got people coming back to the workplace like the hospitality industry and now having to close down in certain areas of the UK. So there's still huge amounts of uncertainty. There's still huge amounts that we can't control. And that doesn't bode well for people because human beings, we like certainty. We like to be able to predict the future. We like to feel that we have a sense of control. So this whole pandemic is really pushing us out of our comfort zone. And as a manager, managing people's mental health can be tricky at the best of times, but it's even more tricky when you're having to manage that remotely, when you don't have the in-person cues that you would maybe normally have when you're face-to-face with somebody. Managing somebody's mental health can be very uncomfortable online. People can find themselves hiding behind their computers, especially if they haven't got the camera on. How do you know what they're seeing? What they're experiencing? What signs have you got to pick up from? So it's wonderful to see that so many more organisations are investing in how to manage mental health in the workplace and focusing on online courses about management mental health awareness, because the whole topic of mental health, it's a huge one. And mental health really does exist on this big spectrum, doesn't it? So at one end of the spectrum, you've got people that are they're just not feeling great. And hey, we can all put our hands up and say that we've had a day, an hour, a week even when we felt like that. You know, when we suddenly have got back into our exercise classes and our gym classes, and then suddenly, with circuit breaks, we're not able to access those resources that would normally really help and be a positive contributing factor to our mental health. So there's lots of understandable and rational reasons why we might just be having a little bit of a wobble, that we might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed, we might be feeling just a bit down. And certainly as well at this time of year when the light levels change, we've got people that may be experiencing the onset of seasonal affective disorder. So we've got that at kind of one end of the spectrum, and then at the other end of the spectrum we've got very severe cases. We've got people that are really experiencing debilitating anxiety, that they're experiencing clinical depression, that they have maybe experiencing trauma. Maybe they've been affected by loved ones passing away from coronavirus and they've not been able to spend their last few months of their life with them. I know one very good friend of mine whose father very, very sadly passed away from cancer, and she wasn't able to see him. She wasn't able to spend those last few precious months of his life with her. And that's soul destroying, absolutely soul destroying. And again, we don't have a solution to this as well. So it's very understandable why people's mental health is being impacted. But managing that as a manager, if you don't know what's what, if you don't understand these conditions, it can be a bit like, trying to find a light switch in the dark. Now, from all of the management mental health training that we run at the Mind Solution, we run numerous polls about what is a manager's greatest challenge when it comes to management mental health. And every single time, fear is the biggest one. Now, that might be the fear of getting something wrong. It might be the fear of making something worse. So the fear of having a conversation with somebody about their mental health, about their well-being, about something that they've experienced, their team members experienced, and this fear of, oh gosh, well, if I ask a question, is it going to suddenly tip that individual over the edge? Are they suddenly going to have a meltdown because of something I ask them? That fear that stops them from maybe probing a little bit deeper. A fear of, well, actually, maybe the questions that I'm asking are a bit too personal. This fear of, well, I don't actually know what to say. And when it comes to fear, if we think about fear, the fear is fear stops us in our tracks. Fear is about our survival response. It's the classic fight, flight, freeze response. So if you're a manager, or if you've got managers in your organisation and they're feeling this fear about addressing something with their team, then the path of least resistance is to not do anything. The path of least resistance can be to just pop their head in the sand and just hope that the issue gets resolved by the individual. And again, there's a huge amount of pressure on managers. My heart goes out to managers because I used to work in human resources. I worked in the corporate world for 12 years. I was a manager. It's not an easy job. Depending on the level that you are at of seniority, you might be responsible for the strategy of your division, department. It depends how many people you are responsible for. I've heard cases of managers that have got 18 people reporting into them, and I'm like, wow, that's exhausting. So depending on your organizational structure can also influence you as a manager. If you've got half your team that are struggling, they've got mental health issues, and you as a manager don't feel comfortable having these conversations, then again, it's like, a house of cards waiting to fall down. So I think we can be a little bit compassionate with our managers. And if you are listening to this and you're a manager yourself, be compassionate. Having these, what can be perceived as big, scary conversations about management and the management of mental health isn't always easy. And if you've not experienced any training on mental health or training on how to have what some people describe as courageous conversations, then it can be natural that we perhaps find ourselves shying away from this. So what I want to do with you is I want to share with you 4 simple strategies that you can adopt. There's so much more that I could teach you about management mental health, but you have to pay us to come into your organisation and deliver that training so that you can feel confident and courageous as a manager. But I'm going to just start off with one strategy that you can adopt as a manager, and that is communicate. Communicate, and then communicate some more. And I often hear managers say that their team seem to be okay. And I would say in response, how do you know that? I remember dealing with one manager as part of some management mental health training, and that's exactly what he said. He said, well, they seem to be okay. And it's like, well, how do you know that? It's a bit like a swan gliding over a river. They can seem to have this wonderful, effortless flow state, but underneath they're paddling away like mad. So as a manager, I'd really invite you to think about what is it that you're seeing or you're hearing or you're feeling that lets you know that your people are okay. Communicating with your people and your team is even more crucial in this whole pandemic and remote working. What are you seeing that's a behavioural change? And often with behaviour, we can have an off day. We can have a day where, maybe it's Monday morning and you're on your usual Monday morning calls and one of your teams maybe just coming across as a bit deflated. Maybe you've asked them, what did you get up to at the weekend? And maybe they're just a bit flat and they're like, well, I didn't really get up to anything. And actually, maybe the fact that they didn't get up to anything, maybe they didn't have an opportunity to have any interaction, that they didn't have any human contact. Maybe they live on their own. Maybe they just felt, oh, God, just fed up of this, which again, it's a really normal human reaction. Does that mean that they've got a mental health problem? No, not necessarily. But if they continue to feel that way, then is their overall mental health and well-being potentially going to be impacted? Yes. So it might be that they come across as a bit flat, a bit deflated. Maybe they've kind of not got that usual energy in their voice that they would normally have. And you can then just pick up with them separately and just say, you seemed on the call a little bit flat and I just want to see, just check in. And depending on the relationship that you have with your team, sometimes, it takes time to build up trust. And a relationship, and I'll come on to trust in a moment, but relationships are everything. Depending on the relationship that you have with that person, they might feel initially uncomfortable opening up, but we shouldn't let that put us off. So it might be that you do just say, okay, well, I'm here if you want to talk. And again, it's about continuing to pursue that. So don't just assume that once you've had that conversation that all's fine and dandy, you've ticked that off the tick box, you've checked in with them and that's done and dusted. Because emotions and moods, they can fluctuate, can't they? One day we can be feeling quite flat and the next day we might actually have a really good day. We might have a good night's sleep, we might get outside, we might get some exercise, we might listen to some inspirational talk, podcast, TED Talk, and start to turn things around in our mind so that we feel in a better place. So I would say absolutely keep communicating with your team and keep communicating consistently. Number 2, picking up on what I said there, trust, building trust. This is so key. And this is one thing that we talk about in our management mental health training program, is how to build trust, both consciously and unconsciously. And one of the biggest ways that you can create trust is also through being vulnerable yourself. And I hear a lot of managers that say that their behaviour is manager-led. So if we want people to feel that they can come to us, that they can speak to us, they can talk to us, then what is it about us that we're projecting that creates that unconscious understanding that I'm safe to be vulnerable with my manager, that I can trust that my manager's got my best interests, that if I speak, then I'm not going to be judged, I'm not going to be discriminated against. Now, that doesn't have to mean that you as a manager need to bare your heart and soul. That's not what I'm saying here. But we are all in this situation together, globally. I think that's reasonable to say. Now, we might be having a different relationship with this situation, but we are all in this situation. And we are all going to have days that are a little bit more trying than others. So I would invite you, when you are talking to your team, to also think about actually what can you do to share your own vulnerability. To say, you know what, I felt like that at times too. And there's been times that I've really struggled. There's been times that I've felt a bit like, there's so many plates to keep spinning and I'm so stretched that it's been really hard for me to sleep. Or maybe, I recognise what you're saying. I felt quite overwhelmed as well. And, we have all of these campaigns, these very well-meaning campaigns about it's time to talk. But particularly in the UK, we don't really have a very strong culture of talking about how we feel. There's that analogy of the stiff upper lip, the British stiff upper lip. Feelings? Oh no, nothing to see here. Move along, sweep it on under the carpet. So whilst it might be time to talk, what we can do as a manager is think about what can we initiate that makes it safe for people to feel that they can express how they're feeling. Because expressing how you're feeling, putting your hand up and saying, you know what, I'm not okay, takes huge amounts of courage. And I've heard some horror stories, absolute toe-curling stories about when individuals actually have put their hands up and the response that they've got from their manager. Even recently, actually, I was talking to a manager who works for one of the big banks. She's a finance manager. She manages her own team, and she was literally at the point of a nervous breakdown. She'd been working 12 hours a day flat out, trying to manage her own mental health, trying to manage her team. There were several people in her team that were really struggling. And her manager was very much, I think, probably under pressure herself. Her manager just kept communicating, you need to do more, you need to do more, you need to do more. So this particular individual, she's just had her foot on the gas for so long in a way that's so not sustainable. But her fear that kept her in this holding pattern of do more was, well, if I scale back on my hours, if I say to my manager I can't cope, then there's going to be consequences. And what happens if I say I can't cope? Does that mean that I'm going to be put on performance management? Does that mean that I'm going to potentially lose my job? All of these questions that appear in the mind. So I encouraged her and I said, it's really understandable why you're feeling the way that you feel, and it's not sustainable. And actually, if you do carry on the way that you are going to have a nervous breakdown. And then you're going to have to make time for illness because your body's going to say, enough, I cannot carry on this way. So let's try and do what we can to put some adjustments in so that you don't reach that breaking point. So she did have a conversation with her manager, And unfortunately, she didn't get the response that we would have liked. Her manager just said, "Well, I think you should have told me before now," in a very uncompassionate, unempathetic tone. So, this individual who has been putting her heart and soul into her work is now feeling very disengaged. She's now feeling very uncared for, very unloved. She's worked for this bank for a really long time. And yeah. Does she really want to keep giving? No, she doesn't. So I could continue. I could continue and give you so many more horror stories. In fact, I will. I'll give you one more. Another wonderful, wonderful woman that I had the pleasure of coming across, who again was a manager. Again, actually worked in finance. And she was in one of those catch-22 situations where this is way before coronavirus, this is like 10 years ago. And she was managing a team of people. She had a couple of vacancies, and they were very natural vacancies, just, people moving on, that natural progression, that natural evolution. And she was in that situation where things were so busy, she was having to pick stuff up, so she didn't really have the time to recruit. And this wonderful woman, she was so conscientious. Now, she did have anxiety, and that's how I'd come across her in the first place in my work as a private therapist. But it wasn't work related, it was something very different. And she was very capable and very studious. She was somebody that I would consider an asset to an organisation. She had the right attitude. She really cared about her team and the work that she did. But she was in this, as I say, this catch-22, trying to keep up, trying to keep all these plates spinning. And I said to her, look, again, I'd really encourage you to speak to your manager and look at what can perhaps be done. Do we need to bring in some support, say from HR, for example, that can help you to recruit? Is there certain projects that can be stopped while you get these vacancies recruited? But, at least let's start the conversation with your manager. And so she did. She spoke to her manager and she said, I'm feeling quite stressed at the moment because of X, Y, and Z. And he turned around and said, well, we're all stressed, aren't we? So this wonderful woman handed in her resignation because she thought, you know what, I'm going to go and find an employer that really cares for me. And she did. So I could continue. I could spend hours talking to you about the stories that I get to hear as a private therapist. So coming back to what I was saying about trust, it does take a huge amount of courage to be able to speak out about how we are feeling. And so when we don't get the response back that we would hope for, it's just going to create more walls. We're just going to shut down. And as an organisation, you're going to have that person that's either going to go on sick leave or they are going to leave. And then you're going to have some real problems. So look at what it is that you're doing as a manager that can send out those signals, both consciously and unconsciously, that you have your team's back, that you are emotionally available to have these conversations, that you're prepared to say, you know what, I get what you say. Number three kind of ties in a little bit with number 2, in that be the change that you want to see in your people. And I talk about this a lot on our management mental health training program, is that we can't expect the best from our people if we're not role modeling that. So something which I often talk about, which is about working smarter and not harder. So as a manager, again, what behaviours are you demonstrating about working smarter and not harder? Because at the end of the day, we can talk about well-being in the workplace until the cows come home. But a lot of behaviour is manager-led because it creates this unconscious level of expectation. So if as a manager you are working 10, 11, 12, possibly even longer days, if you're sending emails at the weekend, on a morning, late at night, if you have rammed your diary back to back and you're not creating any break times in between, if you're not taking a proper, even 30-minute lunch break to recharge your batteries, to plug yourself into nature, to work smarter so that you are more productive, then you are going to be creating this unlevel of expectation within your team that that's what's expected. And the reason that that's dangerous is because there is so much fear around at the moment, not just fear of coronavirus, but financial insecurity. And so where things are so uncertain, we as humans, we're going to do whatever it is that we can to feel safe, to be safe, to make sure that our basic human needs are met. And that involves being able to keep a roof over our head and food on the table. So if we see our manager working at full pelt, then at some level, that's communicating that, you know what, in order to keep your job, that this is what's expected. And I see this a lot actually in some of the data that comes through from millennials. In fact, one of the papers that was recently published a few weeks ago by The Economist on the future of work and digital wellbeing, which I was very thrilled to be one of the expert contributors to, talked about this, how millennials feel under this pressure to perform because that's what they're seeing. What was also interesting about that report is that only 6 out of 10 individuals felt that they'd had a good conversation about their mental health with their managers. So, an opportunity for you to look at yourself and look at what it is that you're projecting, but in a way that's also win-win, because we know with stress, it is not sustainable to work all hours God sends. It's not sustainable to keep our diary chock-a-block and not put in any ultradian dips where we can allow one hemisphere of the brain to flow into the other, which is a very natural cyclical brain pattern. If we keep overriding these natural human functions in the brain, then we are going to find ourselves feeling overwhelmed, feeling burnt out, feeling like we're really having to dig deep for energy. And after a period of time, we are then going to find ourselves potentially having to make time for illness, because your body will find a way of pulling you down if you keep ignoring the red flags. So what is it that you're doing, and what can you start to do differently? What can you stop doing? And what can you keep doing as a manager that's going to be a win-win for both you and your team? And then finally, what I would say is signposting your people. Now, most organisations, especially the larger organisations, do have something in place. And if they didn't have it before, they probably more likely do now since COVID hit. So one of the many things that we teach your managers on the management mental health training is that it's not your job as a manager to fix people. And we certainly wouldn't have that expectation of any manager. We're not trying to turn managers into mini psychiatrists. That's our job at the Mind Solution as private therapists and trainers and teachers. But what you can be as a manager is proactive in signposting your people to internal resources that they have. So, for example, one of the things that we provide organisations with is our employee wellbeing portal, a wonderful digital wellbeing portal that is absolutely chock-a-block with powerful resources to help people and their well-being overall. You can find out more about that at themindsolution.com. But where there are wonderful resources that you can signpost people to, because we forget sometimes what's available to us. So being that proactive person, helping your people to get help sooner rather than later, can make a massive difference. So that's all that we've got time for today. So I hope that those 4 strategies that you can adopt as a manager can really help to make a difference in how you manage the mental health and well-being of your team. If you are an organisation that would like to invest in online management mental health training, we have a fantastic digital solution, because we're obviously not in a position to be doing face-to-face management mental health training at the moment. So do get in touch with us. Drop us an email, info@themindsolution.com, or you can head over to themindsolution.com and have a look at how we run our online management mental health training program. Or equally, if you're interested in our digital employee wellbeing portal, you can book a live demo with us. So thank you for listening. I hope that that's been helpful for you. Do feel free to ask any questions, post any comments, and join us next week where we're going to be looking at resilience. This key word that's often overused, but what do we really mean by resilience? So we're going to be unpacking the difference between classic resilience and natural resilience. So thank you once again. Have a wonderful day. My name's Sarah Maud, and I'll see you next week. Bye bye for now.